As the story continues, the pace remains slow and unhurried. There is no rush here, only the quiet passing of time. You may listen closely, or simply let the sounds fade, as the night gently moves forward, one soft moment at a time, before continuing. Forward, it is useful to settle again into the shape night has taken. Protection is now layered. Habit still matters. Architecture still guides movement. Community systems remain present. Simple devices wait quietly in the background. Nothing announces itself loudly. Night feels managed, but not controlled. As societies moved further forward in time, homes continued to change slowly. Materials improved. Craft skills spread. More people owned doors that fit properly. Frames became tighter. Gaps grew smaller. These improvements were not made specifically for night. They were everyday improvements that happened to make night calmer. When a door closed firmly, sound behaved differently. Drafts were reduced. Unexpected movement became easier to notice. This clarity allowed people to relax their attention even more. The home itself began to do some of the listening. Windows followed the same path. Glass became more common, though still not universal. Where glass appeared, it changed night behavior. Light no longer escaped as easily. Interior spaces felt more contained. People could use a small light without advertising their presence. This subtle change had a strong emotional effect. Curtains and shutters remained important. They softened sound. They blocked sight. They created a sense of enclosure. At night, enclosure translated directly into comfort. A space that felt held. Allowed the body to rest more deeply. Mechanical aids continued to grow quieter. Rather than bells or falling objects, some homes used weighted latches or pressure-based signals. These did not make noise immediately. They changed position slowly. They told a story through touch rather than sound. In the morning, a shifted object meant something had moved during the night. Protection extended beyond sleep itself into memory. This reduced the need for reaction during the night. Not everything required immediate response. Some information could wait until daylight. This understanding reduced nighttime disruption. Rest remained the priority. Street systems continued to expand and standardize. Lighting became more consistent. In central areas, watch systems grew more predictable. Night was increasingly marked by routine rather than uncertainty. People trusted that absence of alarm meant normalcy. With this trust came a new relationship to silence. Silence was no longer unsettling. It was expected. It meant systems were working. It meant nothing required attention. Inside the home, nighttime movement slowed further. People learned to wake without panic, to sit quietly, to listen briefly, to return to sleep if nothing felt wrong. This skill was learned through repetition, not instruction. Furniture placement continued to evolve. Homes were arranged to reduce nighttime travel. Necessary items were kept close. Paths were clear. Protection included preventing falls and confusion. Injury at night was still a serious concern. Animals adapted to these calmer nights as well. Dogs reacted less often, but more meaningfully. Their alerts became rare and therefore important. A quiet animal meant nothing required attention. Children raised in this environment learned to associate night with steadiness. They experienced fewer sudden interruptions. They slept with trust built from consistency. Night felt predictable, even when dark. Illness and age continued to shape arrangements. Mechanical aids were positioned carefully. No one wanted unnecessary noise. Protection remained gentle. By this stage, night protection had become almost invisible. It existed, but it did not demand thought. People trusted their homes to hold through the dark hours. This trust was earned slowly, through years of uneventful nights. As technology continued to develop, this invisibility would deepen. Protection would become quieter still, less tactile, more abstract. And with that change, people would begin to relate to night in a new way. As protection became quieter and more invisible, people slowly changed how they paid attention to night. Not by caring less, but by caring differently. Attention no longer rested on individual sounds or movements. It rested on the absence of disruption. When nothing called out for notice, that itself became reassuring. A still night meant systems were holding, doors remained where they should be. Streets followed expected rhythms. Homes felt stable without requiring constant confirmation. This shift altered how people woke during the night. They no longer rose fully at the smallest disturbance. Instead, they paused. They listened briefly. They assessed without urgency. Most sounds resolved themselves. The house settled. The body returned to rest. Trust played a larger role than ever before. Not blind trust, but practiced trust. It was built from repetition. Night after night of nothing happening. Morning after morning of safe return to daylight. This pattern taught the mind that rest was reasonable. Mechanical systems, though still simple by modern standards, became more reliable. Latches fit better. Hinges moved smoothly. Frames aligned properly. When something moved, it was noticeable. When it did not, that silence was meaningful. Some homes adopted devices that worked through pressure rather than sound. A door that resisted slightly if pushed. A latch that shifted position subtly. These changes could be felt in the morning. They did not interrupt sleep. Protection extended beyond the night itself into awareness afterward. Lighting practices continued to emphasize restraint. Most homes slept in near darkness. A single light source remained available, not active. People trusted their familiarity. With space more than illumination, they knew where walls were. They knew where steps began. This knowledge reduced fear of movement if waking was necessary. Outside the home, nighttime systems became increasingly predictable. Watch routes were stable. Lighting patterns rarely changed. People learned what a normal night sounded like from a distance. This consistency allowed them to ignore much of what they heard. Filtering replaced vigilance. The sound of the city at night became almost soothing. Distant footsteps. A call marking the hour. Occasional movement passing through lighted streets. These sounds blended into a steady background. When something broke that pattern, attention arrived naturally. Inside the home, protection routines shortened further. Not because people cared less, but because systems worked better. Preparation no longer felt heavy. It felt automatic. Hands moved without thought. Bars slid into place. Shutters closed. Lights lowered. The body recognized completion. Furniture and layout continued to support this ease. Homes were arranged so that nighttime movement required minimal effort. Water was nearby. Warmth was accessible. Paths were memorized. Protection meant reducing the need for action. Animals adapted fully to this calmer environment. They slept more deeply. Their alerts became rare. When they did react, it mattered. Humans trusted these signals precisely because they were infrequent. Children growing up during this period experienced night as stable and unremarkable. They did not associate darkness with constant checking or tension. They learned that night could pass quietly without intervention. This understanding shaped their sense of safety long-term. In households caring for the elderly or ill, systems were used carefully. Anything that might create unnecessary disturbance was avoided. Protection remained gentle. Rest was preserved wherever possible. By this stage, many people no longer thought actively about nighttime protection at all. They prepared, they rested, they trusted. Protection existed as background structure rather than conscious effort. This deep trust would shape how future technologies were received. When new systems promised even greater invisibility, people welcomed them, not because they wanted more control, but because they wanted night to remain quiet. As protection continued to retreat into the background, night itself felt smoother. There were fewer moments of interruption, fewer reasons to wake fully. Homes no longer asked for constant attention once they were settled. This did not mean people became careless. It meant that preparation had become reliable enough to step aside. The work was done before sleep. Night was allowed to unfold on its own. The most noticeable change during this period was how little people interacted with protection. Once darkness fully arrived, doors were secured earlier, lights were reduced sooner. After that, there was very little to do. The house held its shape. The night moved through it quietly. People learned to trust this holding. They no longer expected to intervene unless something truly unusual occurred. This expectation lowered mental strain. Sleep grew deeper and more continuous. Short awakenings still happened, but they resolved quickly. Mechanical systems became more abstract, not complex, but indirect. A latch that resisted pressure evenly. A door that could not be lifted easily from its frame. These were not dramatic features. They did not announce themselves. They simply worked. Because these systems did not make noise, people relied more heavily on the absence of disturbance. Nothing moved, nothing sounded, nothing required response. This silence was no longer suspicious. It was reassuring. Night sounds outside the home softened as well. Better street organization reduced unnecessary movement. Lighting guided behavior. People chose routes carefully. Late activity followed predictable paths. The city itself learned to sleep in stages. Inside the home, the body adapted to this predictability. Heart rate slowed more easily. Muscles relaxed sooner. Rest arrived without resistance. Protection supported the body rather than challenging it. Children raised in this environment experienced fewer nighttime disruptions. They learned that waking did not require alarm, that listening briefly was enough, that the house would remain as it was when they fell asleep. This consistency built long-term calm. For adults, this period marked a subtle emotional shift. Night was no longer something to be managed actively. It became something to enter, like sleep itself. A transition, rather than a test. Care for vulnerable household members continued to shape how protection was applied. Systems were placed where they would not startle. Lights were positioned gently. Nothing was designed to shock the senses awake. Protection respected fragility. Animals mirrored this calm. They slept longer. They reacted less often. Their stillness became another signal that nothing required attention. Morning reinforced this trust. Doors were where they should be. Objects remained undisturbed. The night had passed without demand. This daily confirmation strengthened confidence over time. By now, many people would struggle to describe exactly how their homes were protected. Not because protection was absent, but because it no longer stood out. It was part of the environment. Like walls or floors, this invisibility changed how people thought about safety. They expected it to work without their involvement. They measured success by how little it intruded on rest. A system that woke them unnecessarily was considered. Flawed as societies moved forward, this expectation would grow stronger. People would increasingly favor solutions that required no attention at all. Protection would become quieter, more hidden, more removed from human senses. We will move into this later stage, where night protection became almost entirely silent, operating beneath awareness, and where people began to forget how much effort once went into simply sleeping safely through the dark. Before continuing forward, it helps to pause gently and remember how quiet night has become. Protection now exists mostly out of sight, out of sound. Homes hold themselves through darkness with very little involvement from the people inside them. Night arrives softly, without demanding preparation beyond habit. As societies moved further into this stage, the meaning of safety began to shift again. Not outwardly, internally. People no longer measured protection by what they did each night. They measured it by how rarely they had to think about it at all. This change did not remove care from the home. It changed where care lived. Attention moved away from doors and windows and settled deeper into trust. Trust in construction. Trust in systems. Trust in the idea that night would pass without intervention. Homes reflected this new relationship. With darkness, design emphasized continuity. Walls were smoother, frames fit tightly, openings were fewer and more intentional. When something was closed, it stayed closed. This reliability allowed people to stop checking. Night routines became shorter and quieter than ever before. A final look around the room. A light lowered. A familiar sound of a latch settling. After that, effort ended. The house was expected to hold until morning. Sound inside the home changed character. There was less of it. Better construction reduced. Unexpected noises. Floors creaked less. Windows rattled less. Silence grew deeper. And for the first time, that silence felt entirely safe. People learned to sleep without listening actively. Awareness drifted instead of remaining alert. If something truly unusual occurred, the body would still respond. But most nights passed without any reason to wake. Outside, cities also grew quieter in certain ways. Movement followed clearer rules. Lighting guided behavior. Late activity concentrated along known routes. Residential areas rested more fully. This predictability extended protection outward from the home into the street itself. Formal watch systems still existed, but they became less noticeable. Their success lay in their invisibility. If nothing happened, no one spoke of them. They were present precisely so they would not be felt. Mechanical protection continued to evolve towards silence. No bells, no sudden signals. Instead, resistance. Reinforcement. Design choices that made unwanted movement difficult rather than dramatic. Protection discouraged disturbance rather than announcing it. This discouraged not only intrusion, but fear. A quiet environment told the body it was safe to rest. There was no need for readiness. Readiness had already been built into the space. Children growing up in this era learned a different story about night. They did not associate darkness with preparation or checking. They associated it with calm, with routine, with the certainty that the house would remain unchanged while they slept. For adults, this consistency changed emotional patterns. Night was no longer approached cautiously. It was welcomed. The transition from wakefulness to sleep felt smooth. Nothing in the environment demanded alertness. Care for the elderly and ill continued to guide how these quiet systems were used. Protection remained gentle. Anything that caused sudden noise or confusion was avoided. Nighttime safety meant preserving rest above all else. Animals reflected this calm environment. They slept deeply. They rarely reacted. When they did, it carried meaning precisely because it was unusual. Morning continued to reinforce trust. Homes looked as they had the night before. Doors held. Windows stayed still. Nothing demanded explanation. This repetition strengthened belief. In quiet systems, over time, people began to forget earlier forms of protection entirely. They no longer remembered when night required constant listening, or when sleep came lightly and easily broke. Safety felt natural now, unremarkable. This forgetting would shape the future. As new technologies promised even greater invisibility, people accepted them readily, not because they sought control, but because they wanted night to remain undisturbed. We will continue forward into this later phase where protection became almost entirely abstract, and where the distance between people and the work of nighttime safety grew wider than ever before. As protection grew more abstract, people's relationship with night continued to soften. Safety was no longer something to be performed. It was something assumed. The effort had been moved elsewhere, into design, planning, and systems that worked quietly without instruction. This assumption changed how people thought about responsibility. Earlier generations had carried it consciously each evening. Now it was distributed across materials, structures, and routines established long before night arrived. Individuals no longer felt personally accountable for every sound. The environment itself had taken on that role. Homes at this stage were designed to reduce decision-making after dark. Doors closed smoothly, windows sealed firmly. There was little to adjust once the evening routine was complete. This reduced mental effort. The body recognized completion and relaxed more easily. Nighttime interruptions became rare enough that they felt notable when they occurred. A sudden sound stood out precisely because most nights were quiet. When attention was required, it arrived. Naturally, without panic. People trusted their instincts because those instincts were rarely needed. This trust extended to sleep itself. People slept longer without waking. They no longer expected disturbance. Rest was no longer layered with vigilance. It was allowed to be deep. Street environments reflected this same philosophy. Lighting was designed to guide, not overwhelm. Movement patterns were predictable. Noise was reduced by planning rather than enforcement. Cities learned how to rest in sections, allowing night to pass smoothly across large areas. Formal security systems continued to operate, but quietly. They were evaluated not by how often they acted, but by how rarely they were noticed. Success meant absence. A night without incident was considered the ideal outcome. Mechanical protections within homes followed this logic. They resisted intrusion without signaling alarm. Reinforced doors, stable frames, quiet barriers. These features worked through physical presence rather than reaction. They did not wake sleepers unnecessarily. People came to expect this restraint. Anything that caused sudden noise was seen as disruptive rather than protective. Night protection was judged by how well it preserved rest. Comfort became part of the definition of safety. Children growing up during this time absorbed these expectations deeply. They learned that night was not something to monitor. It was something to pass through. Sleep was steady. Waking was rare. This shaped their long-term relationship with rest and security. For adults, the absence of nightly concern created emotional space. Worries that once surfaced in darkness no longer found a trigger. The environment did not provoke alertness. Thoughts slowed naturally. Night became a pause rather than a challenge. Care for vulnerable household members continued to guide how systems were chosen. Anything that startled or confused was avoided. Protection had to be calm to be considered effective. Gentleness was valued over intensity. Animals remained sensitive to changes, but reacted less often. Their stillness became another signal of stability. A sleeping animal reinforced the sense that nothing required attention. Morning routines reinforced this quiet confidence. Homes remained unchanged. Nothing needed explanation. The night had passed without leaving a mark. This repetition strengthened trust further. Over time, people stopped thinking of night protection as an activity at all. It became part of the background of daily life, like walls, like roofs, like floors beneath the bed. This backgrounding of safety altered expectations for the future. People began to favor solutions that demanded even less awareness. If protection could function without thought, that was considered progress. Night was expected to be effortless. This expectation would shape the next stage of change. As systems became more complex and less visible, people would grow further removed from the work of nighttime safety. Protection would continue, but understanding would fade. We will move into this phase where night became calmer than ever, but also more dependent on systems few people truly noticed or understood. As protection faded further into the background, night became almost effortless. There was little to do once evening arrived. The home no longer asked for confirmation. It simply held. This ease changed how people experienced darkness itself. Night was no longer a space that required negotiation. It was a condition that passed. Quietly, people entered it without preparation beyond habit. They trusted that nothing would demand their attention unless it truly mattered. The absence of effort became a signal of success. A secure home was one that allowed the mind to release control. If people slept through the night without waking, that was considered ideal. Any system that interrupted rest unnecessarily was seen as intrusive. Mechanical protection at this stage worked through resistance rather than response. Doors were difficult to force. Frames held firm. Windows resisted movement naturally. Nothing announced itself. Nothing needed to. The goal was not to wake sleepers, but to prevent disturbance entirely, because of this, awareness shifted even further inward. People no longer listened for specific sounds. They listened only for disruption of silence. And even then, they responded slowly, calmly, without urgency. This calm response was learned. It came from long stretches of uneventful nights. The body learned that waking fully was rarely required. Brief awareness was enough. Most sensations passed without meaning. Homes reinforced this learning. Materials absorbed sound. Design reduced vibration. Movement within the house became minimal at night. When something did change, it stood out clearly. This clarity prevented imagination from filling gaps. Outside, the city mirrored this stillness. Nighttime activity became concentrated and predictable. Lighting guided movement away from residential areas. Late travel followed known routes. Unexpected presence became rare enough to be noticeable without anxiety. Formal systems continued to exist, but people rarely thought about them. Their reliability made them invisible. Success meant not being remembered. Protection worked best when it left no impression at all. Children raised in this environment internalized these expectations deeply. They learned that night was stable, that the house would not change while they slept, that waking in darkness did not require fear. This confidence carried into adulthood. For adults, night became a mental pause. Thought slowed naturally. Concerns softened. The environment did not provoke alertness. Sleep arrived without resistance. Care within the home continued quietly. Those who needed attention were supported without disturbance. Lighting was gentle. Movement was slow. Protection respected vulnerability rather than challenging it. Animals reflected this calm consistency. They slept longer. Their reactions became rare and meaningful. A sudden alert carried weight precisely because it was unusual. Morning reinforced everything that night had taught. Homes looked unchanged. Doors remained secure. Nothing required explanation. The night had passed cleanly. Over time, people stopped, associating safety with action altogether. Protection became something that existed independently of them. They expected it to work without effort, awareness, or understanding. This expectation reshaped how new systems were judged. Anything that required attention was considered outdated. Anything that demanded learning was seen as inconvenient. The ideal was complete invisibility. As societies moved forward, this distance between people and nighttime protection would grow. Systems would become more complex, more abstract, and less understood by those who relied on them. Night would become calmer than ever, but also more dependent on things unseen. We will move into this later stage, where protection operated almost entirely beyond human senses, and where people slept more soundly than ever before, while knowing less and less about what kept their homes safe through the dark. Before moving onward, it helps to settle once more into the quiet that now defines night. Protection has become distant, silent, almost abstract. Homes no longer ask anything of the people inside them once sleep begins. They hold themselves. This stage, night is shaped less by human behavior and more by systems that work continuously in the background. People trust these systems without needing to understand them fully. They expect safety to function without explanation. This expectation changes how night feels emotionally. Earlier generations carried a gentle awareness into sleep. Now, awareness loosens more completely. People fall asleep quickly. They stay asleep longer. The night passes without negotiation. Homes are built with this expectation in mind. Design favors continuity over flexibility. Openings are few. Transitions between inside and outside are clearly defined. Once closed, boundaries remain stable until morning. This stability reduces mental effort. People do not revisit decisions made earlier in the evening. They do not wonder whether something has changed. The house is trusted to remain consistent through darkness. Sound inside the home is minimal. Construction absorbs vibration. Materials soften movement. The environment itself encourages stillness. When sound does occur, it stands out clearly. Clarity replaces constant monitoring. Lighting is almost entirely internalized. Homes sleep in darkness. A single source of light remains available if needed. It is rarely used. Orientation comes from familiarity rather than illumination. Outside, night systems operate quietly and predictably. Movement follows patterns shaped by planning rather than habit. Lighting guides behavior without drawing attention. Most people rarely encounter unexpected activity after dark. Because of this predictability, the idea of threat fades from nightly thought. Not eliminated, but distant. People do not imagine danger unless something clearly breaks pattern. The mind remains calm by default. Mechanical protection now functions primarily through prevention. Resistance is built into materials. Access points discourage movement rather than announcing it. Nothing reacts dramatically. Nothing demands attention. Protection is passive by design. This passivity supports deeper rest. The body no longer prepares for interruption. Muscles relax fully. Breathing slows earlier. Sleep settles without resistance. Children raised in this environment rarely experience. Night is uncertain. They associate darkness with continuity, with familiarity, with the assurance that morning will arrive without incident. Night feels safe because it is uneventful. For adults, this uneventfulness creates emotional space. Thoughts do not accelerate. In darkness, the environment does not stimulate alertness. Night becomes a pause rather than a test. Care within the household adapts to this calm. Systems are chosen to avoid unnecessary disturbance. Nothing is designed to startle. Protection remains gentle. Animals reflect this same stillness. They sleep deeply. They respond rarely. When they do react, it carries significance. They're calm. Presence reinforces trust in the environment. Morning confirms everything. Homes remain unchanged. Nothing demands explanation. The night has passed quietly again. This repetition strengthens confidence over time. By this stage, people have largely forgotten what active night protection once required. They no longer remember checking sounds, listening closely, preparing for interruption. Safety feels natural, effortless. This forgetting shapes expectations for the future. People come to believe that night should never demand attention. Any disruption feels abnormal. Any noise feels intrusive. As we continue, we will move into this final transformation, a time when protection becomes almost entirely invisible, when systems operate beyond awareness, And when night, though calmer than ever before, grows further removed from human understanding, as night protection moved further beyond awareness, people adjusted their expectations without realizing it. They no longer thought of safety as something that needed renewal each evening. It was assumed to be continuous, always present, always working. This assumption shaped how evenings ended. There was no longer a clear moment when protection began. It was already in place. Nights simply arrived, and the home remained unchanged. This continuity reduced the mental boundary between day and night. Homes at this stage were designed to minimize uncertainty. Open spaces were fewer, transitions were controlled. Once inside, there was little reason to interact with the outside world until morning. This separation allowed the mind to release concern completely. Sound awareness shifted again. Instead of listening outward, people listened inward. They noticed their own breathing, the weight of blankets, the quiet presence of others sleeping nearby. The environment encouraged attention to the body rather than the surroundings' mechanical systems. Continued to function without interaction. They required no nightly confirmation, no testing, no adjustment. Their reliability was proven by repetition. Every uneventful night reinforced trust. Lighting outside the home became almost symbolic. It existed to guide movement, not to protect directly. People rarely interacted with it. Its presence was felt rather than noticed. This reduced stimulation during nighttime waking. Inside, darkness deepened further. People slept with confidence in their spatial memory. They knew where objects were without seeing them. This familiarity reduced fear of movement if waking occurred. Because night passed quietly so often, disruption became increasingly rare. When something unusual did occur, it stood out sharply. Attention arrived immediately, without confusion. Calm response remained possible precisely because interruption was uncommon. Children raised in this environment developed strong associations between darkness and rest. They did not expect interruption. They learned that waking at night did not require vigilance. This shaped lifelong sleep patterns. For adults, night became emotionally neutral. It no longer carried meaning beyond rest. There was no need to reflect, prepare, or listen. Sleep was simply sleep. Care within the home continued. To adapt, systems were chosen for their ability to remain unnoticed. Anything that demanded frequent attention was replaced. Protection was judged by how little it interfered with care and rest. Animals mirrored this stillness. They slept through most nights without reaction. Their calm reinforced trust. When they did respond, it was treated as meaningful information. Not alarm, morning continued to confirm this stability. Homes remained intact. Systems held. Nothing required explanation. This repetition strengthened belief in invisible protection. Over time, people became less aware of how night protection functioned at all. They knew it existed, but not how. Understanding was replaced by expectation. Expectation replaced awareness. This distance from the work of protection changed how new systems were introduced. People accepted them easily as long as they promised silence. Any technology that required learning or interaction felt intrusive. As we continue, we will move toward this final stage, a time when protection became so deeply embedded that it was no longer felt as part of night itself. and when people slept more peacefully than ever, while knowing almost nothing about what guarded their homes through the dark, as protection became almost entirely invisible, night lost much of its earlier meaning. It was no longer a time that required preparation, awareness, or adjustment. It simply arrived and passed without asking anything in return. People did not feel watched or guarded. They felt uninterrupted. The systems around them worked quietly, continuously, without announcing their presence. This quiet operation shaped how night was experienced emotionally. Darkness no longer carried responsibility. Homes, at this stage, were trusted environments. Once evening routines were complete, there was nothing left to do. Doors closed because that was how doors functioned. Windows stayed still because that was expected. Boundaries held without confirmation because of this trust. People stopped revisiting decisions made earlier in the evening. There was no impulse to check, no need to listen closely. The mind released control willingly. Sleep arrived smoothly. Sound inside the home became almost unnoticeable. Materials absorbed vibration. Design reduced movement. Silence was deep and uninterrupted. When a sound did occur, it was immediately clear that it was unusual. Clarity replaced constant attention. Outside, the night environment followed predictable patterns. Movement was limited. Lighting guided behavior gently. Unexpected. Activity was rare enough to stand out naturally. People did not imagine threats where none existed. Mechanical protection now worked almost entirely through prevention. It did not react. It did not warn. It simply made disturbance difficult. This reduced the need for response altogether, because nothing reacted, nothing startled. The body remained calm even when partially waking. Breathing stayed slow. Thoughts did not race. Sleep returned easily. Children raised in this environment rarely learned to associate night with uncertainty. They experienced darkness as stable and uneventful. This formed deep trust. Night felt neutral, safe because it changed nothing. Adults experienced night as a pause in effort. The day ended cleanly. There was no need to remain alert. The environment did not ask for readiness. Rest was uninterrupted. Care within the household remained gentle and unobtrusive. Systems were chosen specifically to avoid disturbance. Anything that created noise without purpose was removed. Protection respected sleep above all else. Animals mirrored this calm consistency. They slept deeply. They reacted rarely. Their stillness became another signal that nothing required attention. Morning arrived without consequence. Homes looked exactly as they had the night before. Nothing needed explanation. This repetition reinforced trust further. By this stage, most people could not describe how their homes were protected at night, not because protection was absent, but because it had become inseparable from the environment itself. Like walls, like ceilings, like floors beneath the bed. This invisibility reshaped expectations permanently. People came to believe that safety should never interrupt rest. Any disruption felt abnormal. Any noise felt unnecessary as societies continued forward. This expectation would define the future of nighttime protection. Systems would become quieter still, more hidden, more removed from human understanding. Night would become calmer than ever before. but also more dependent on things unseen. We will move into this final stage, a time when protection operated entirely beneath awareness, and when people slept through the dark without ever knowing how much was working silently to keep their homes unchanged until morning. Before moving further, it is worth resting again inside the quiet that now defines night. Protection has become almost completely unseen. Homes no longer signal safety. They assume it. Night arrives without ceremony, and sleep follows without resistance. At this stage, people rarely connect the feeling of rest with the systems that make it possible. Safety is no longer felt as presence. It is felt as absence. The absence of interruption, the absence of sound, the absence of concern. This shift changes how people think about responsibility. Earlier generations carried night with them. They listened. They prepared. They responded. Now, responsibility feels distant, delegated to structures, materials, and processes that operate without human input. Homes reflect this delegation clearly. Boundaries are fixed and reliable. Once closed, they remain unchanged. There is no need to test them, no need to confirm them. Trust has replaced repetition. Because of this, the transition into sleep becomes shorter. People do not linger in awareness. They do not wait for the night to settle. It is already settled. The body recognizes this stability and releases tension quickly. Sound inside the home is almost entirely removed from consciousness. Not because sound does not exist, but because it no longer varies. Uniformity replaces surprise. The mind filters everything without effort. Only disruption would rise to awareness. Outside, cities operate in a similar way. Nighttime movement is rare and guided. Lighting exists to direct behavior rather than illuminate space. Most people never encounter uncertainty after dark. They sleep through it entirely. This predictability reshapes emotional experience. Night no longer carries mystery. It carries continuity. The same environment that exists before sleep exists upon waking. Nothing changes. Mechanical protection now functions almost entirely as resistance. It does not react. It does not communicate. It simply prevents movement. This prevention is silent. It does not disturb the sleeping mind, because nothing reacts. People are not trained to respond. They are trained to rest. If something does break this pattern, attention arrives suddenly but clearly. There is no confusion. Only recognition that something is different. Children raised in this environment grow up without learning nighttime caution. They do not associate darkness with vigilance. They associate it with stillness. This shapes their sense of safety deeply. Adults experience night as emotional neutral ground. Thoughts slow naturally. Concerns do not intensify. The environment offers no stimulation for alertness. Sleep becomes a smooth continuation of rest. Care for vulnerable household members adapts to this quiet expectation. Anything that might startle or confuse is avoided. Protection is chosen for its gentleness. Nighttime care is meant to preserve calm, not interrupt it. Animals reflect this same pattern. They sleep deeply. They rarely respond to movement. When they do, it carries meaning because it is so rare. Their stillness reinforces human trust in the environment. Morning consistently confirms this trust. Homes remain unchanged. nothing requires explanation. Night has left no mark. This repetition strengthens belief in invisible systems. Over time, people stop thinking of night as something that needs guarding at all. They think of it only as a pause, a gap between days. Protection is assumed to exist, but not considered. This assumption shapes how new systems are accepted. People prefer solutions that demand nothing from them. No attention, no learning, no interaction. The ideal is complete silence. As this expectation deepens, people become further removed from understanding how safety is maintained. They rely on systems they do not see and processes they do not notice. Night becomes calmer than ever before. We will continue into this final approach to night, a stage where protection is fully abstract and where people sleep peacefully, unaware of how distant they have become from the work that once made such rest possible. As protection became fully abstract, night lost nearly all of its former signals. There were no reminders, no sounds to interpret, no routines to perform beyond what had already been completed during the day. Safety no longer arrived with night. It was already present. This constant presence changed how people understood time itself. Night was no longer a phase that required transition. It blended smoothly into evening and morning. Sleep no longer sat between moments of awareness. It rested inside continuity. Homes at this stage were designed to discourage interaction. After dark, nothing needed adjustment. Nothing invited checking. Once the home was closed for the day, it remained unchanged. This stability removed the temptation to stay mentally engaged. Because of this, the mind let go more completely. Thought slowed without effort. The body did not remain alert beneath sleep. Rest deepened because nothing in the environment suggested uncertainty. Sound was almost entirely removed from nighttime meaning. Uniform quiet replaced variation. The house no longer spoke through creaks or shifts. It remained steady. When a sound did occur, it was unmistakable. Attention arrived instantly, without confusion. Outside, cities followed the same logic. Night activity was rare, regulated, and predictable. Lighting guided movement along specific routes. Residential areas rested fully. People rarely encountered anything unexpected after dark. This predictability reshaped emotional response. Fear did not fade because danger vanished. It faded because uncertainty disappeared. The environment no longer suggested possibility. It suggested continuity. Mechanical protection at this stage functioned entirely without communication. It did not warn. It did not respond. It simply resisted change. Movement was difficult. Access was limited. Disturbance was unlikely. Because of this, people no longer practiced response. They practiced rest. Their bodies were not trained to wake quickly. They were trained to remain asleep unless truly necessary. This deepened trust further. Children raised in this environment learned almost nothing about nighttime protection. Not because it was absent, but because it never revealed itself. They slept without interruption. They woke to unchanged surroundings. Night taught them nothing beyond continuity. Adults experienced night as an emotional blank space. Concerns did not intensify. Thoughts did not sharpen. The environment offered no reason for alertness. Sleep became a default state. Care within the home adjusted to this expectation. Systems were chosen specifically to avoid disturbance. Anything that required response was seen as a flaw. Protection had to remain invisible to be acceptable. Animals mirrored this stillness. They slept through the night without reacting. Their calm reinforced the belief that nothing required attention. When they did respond, it was taken seriously precisely because it was so rare. Morning reinforced this worldview every day. Homes looked exactly the same. Nothing had changed. The night left no trace. This repetition strengthened trust beyond question. Over time, people stopped associating safety with action entirely. Protection became an assumption rather than a concept. They knew it existed only because nothing contradicted it. This distance from understanding reshaped attitudes toward responsibility. People no longer felt personally connected to the work of staying safe at night. They relied on systems maintained by others, designed by others, understood by few. Night became calmer than at any previous point in history. But it also became more detached from human awareness. People slept more soundly than ever before, while knowing almost nothing about what made that sleep possible. We will move toward the closing stage of this story, a time when protection reached its quietest form, and when night, for most people, became something that simply passed unnoticed between one day and the next. As night protection reached its most distant form, it became almost impossible to separate safety from the ordinary shape of life. There were no markers to notice, no moments of reassurance. Protection no longer arrived as a feeling. It existed as a condition. People no longer thought about what happened after they fell asleep. They did not imagine the night unfolding around them. They expected it to remain unchanged. Sleep was not something guarded. It was something uninterrupted. Homes reflected this expectation clearly. They were designed to resist change rather than respond to it. Once closed, they stayed closed. Once settled, they remained settled. The environment did not invite interaction. It discouraged it gently. Because of this, awareness faded earlier in the night. The mind did not linger in listening. There was no reason to wait. Nothing in the environment suggested instability. The body released control willingly. Sound, once central to night protection, lost its meaning almost entirely. The absence of variation became normal. Uniform, quiet replaced interpretive listening. People no longer translated sounds into meaning. Meaning only returned if something broke the pattern. Outside, the night world followed the same logic. Movement was minimal. Paths were controlled. Lighting directed behavior without drawing attention. Residential spaces rested deeply. Cities slept in predictable layers. Mechanical protection now worked without sensation. It offered no feedback, no signal of engagement. It simply prevented access. Disturbance rarely reached the sleeping environment at all. This lack of disturbance trained the body in a new way. Sleep deepened. Waking became rare. When it did occur, it was brief and calm. There was no rush to interpret, no urgency to act. Children raised in this world learned that night did not require awareness. They slept through darkness without curiosity. They woke without memory of interruption. Night taught them nothing about caution, only continuity. Adults experienced night as emotional neutrality. Thoughts did not intensify. Concerns did not sharpen. The environment offered no stimulus for alertness. Sleep arrived without negotiation. Care within the household adapted completely to this expectation. Protection systems were chosen for silence above all else. Anything that required reaction was viewed as failure. The ideal system was one that never made itself known. Animals mirrored this quiet detachment. They slept longer. They reacted less. Their stillness became another unspoken confirmation that nothing required attention. When they did react, it carried immediate meaning precisely because it was so rare. Morning reinforced this deep trust every day. Homes appeared unchanged. Nothing required explanation. The night left no trace. This repetition removed doubt entirely. Over time, people stopped connecting safety with effort of any kind. Protection was no longer something that happened. It was something assumed. They relied on systems they could not describe, on structures they did not examine, on processes they did not notice. This distance reshaped how people related to responsibility. Safety was no longer personal. It belonged to infrastructure, to design, to maintenance performed elsewhere by unseen hands. Night became quieter than at any earlier point, but it also became more abstract. People slept soundly, while understanding almost nothing about what protected them. The work that once required attention, listening, and shared responsibility had vanished from awareness. As we move into the final part, we will come to rest with this outcome. A night that is calm, silent, and effortless. A night that asks nothing. And a quiet reflection on what has been gained and what has slowly faded. As people learned to sleep without ever noticing what keeps the darkness unchanged until morning. Before the story comes to rest, it is worth settling one final time into the night as it now exists. Protection has reached its quietest form. It no longer announces itself. It no longer asks for attention. Homes remain unchanged through darkness, and people expect this to be normal. At this point, night is almost empty of meaning. Not empty in a cold way, empty in a gentle one. It is a stretch of hours that passes without demand. People fall asleep assuming that nothing will require them until morning. This assumption reshapes how the home is felt emotionally. The house is no longer something that needs to be secured each evening. It is something that simply holds. Walls, doors, and boundaries are trusted without thought. The effort of protection has been fully removed from daily awareness. Earlier generations carried night with them. They listened, they noticed, they responded. Now, none of this is expected. Responsibility has been absorbed into systems so stable that they feel natural. Homes reflect this final shift clearly. Design prioritizes permanence. Change is minimized. Movement is discouraged by structure rather than resisted by reaction. Nothing inside the home is meant to surprise the sleeper. Sound is nearly irrelevant now. Uniform quiet replaces variation. People do not interpret noises because there are so few to interpret. The mind does not stay half awake. Sleep is allowed to deepen fully. Outside, night has been simplified as well. Cities rest in organized silence. Movement follows predictable paths. Lighting directs behavior gently and consistently. Residential spaces are left undisturbed. Night flows around homes without touching them. Because of this, fear rarely appears in darkness. Not because risk has vanished, but because uncertainty. has been reduced to almost nothing. The environment no longer suggests possibility, it suggests stability. Mechanical protection now works entirely through absence. Nothing moves, nothing reacts, nothing calls attention to itself. Protection succeeds by preventing disturbance from ever reaching the sleeper. This success reshapes the body's relationship with rest. Breathing slows earlier, muscles relax more fully, waking becomes rare. When it happens, it is brief and calm. The body trusts the environment completely. Children raised in this world inherit this trust without question. They do not learn night as something to manage. They learn it as something that passes quietly. Darkness does not invite imagination. It invites rest. Adults experience night as emotional stillness. Thoughts do not sharpen. Concerns do not gather strength. The environment offers no reason for alertness. Sleep arrives without negotiation. Care within the home has adapted fully to this expectation. Systems are chosen to preserve silence. Anything that demands reaction is avoided. Protection is defined by how little it interferes with rest. Animals reflect this final calm. They sleep deeply. They react rarely. Their stillness reinforces the sense that nothing requires attention. A sudden response, if it occurs, carries immediate meaning precisely because it is so unusual. Morning continues to confirm everything. Homes remain unchanged. No evidence of night remains. Nothing needs explanation. This repetition strengthens trust beyond awareness. By now, most people could not describe how their homes are protected at night, not because protection is weak, but because it has become inseparable from ordinary life, like gravity, like weather. This final stage represents both comfort and distance. Comfort because rest is deeper than ever before. Distance because the work that once connected people to their environment has faded from memory. As we continue into the final stretch, the story will not introduce anything new. It will simply rest with what remains: a quiet night, a stable home, and a world where protection has become so complete that it is no longer felt at all. As the night reaches its most settled form, there is very little left to describe in terms of action. Almost everything that once required effort has been absorbed into the background. Protection does not happen during the night anymore. It has already happened before sleep begins. This change alters how people think about effort itself. Earlier, effort was visible. It involved checking, listening, responding. Now, effort is hidden in planning, design, and maintenance carried out far from bedtime. Night has been freed from responsibility. Homes at this stage are experienced as complete environments. They do not shift noticeably when darkness arrives. There is no sense of transition that needs to be managed. Evening fades into sleep without ceremony. The house remains the same shape throughout. Because nothing changes, attention has nowhere to attach itself. The mind does not search for signals. It does not remain partially awake. Sleep becomes a continuous state rather than a fragile one. This continuity reshapes memory. People wake without recalling the night at all. It leaves no impression, no sounds remembered, no interruptions noted. The hours between days disappear quietly. Outside the home, this invisibility of night protection mirrors itself. Streets rest under systems that require no observation from those inside. Movement is rare and guided. Lighting exists without calling. Attention. The city holds its form without disturbance. Because of this, night no longer invites reflection. It is not a time when worries surface. The environment offers no stimulus for alertness or imagination. Thoughts slow naturally. Concerns lose momentum. This emotional quiet changes how people understand safety. Safety is no longer associated with awareness or readiness. It is associated with silence and continuity. Anything that interrupts rest feels out of place. Care within the household has fully aligned with this expectation. Nighttime needs are anticipated and softened. Lighting is gentle. Movement is minimal. Nothing is designed to shock the senses awake. Protection has become synonymous with calm. Children raised in this world rarely think about night at all. They do not ask questions about what happens while they sleep. They assume nothing happens. This assumption shapes their understanding of safety permanently. Adults share this quiet acceptance. They no longer feel connected to the work of protection. They rely on systems they never encountered directly. Safety is something that exists somewhere else, handled by unseen processes. Animals continue to mirror this environment. They rest without disturbance. Their calm presence reinforces the sense that nothing requires attention. When they do react, it feels significant because it is so rare. Morning consistently reinforces this trust. The home looks unchanged. Nothing suggests that night contained activity. This repetition strengthens the belief that night is inert. Over time, people lose the language to describe protection at night. Not because it has vanished, but because it has become too distant to notice. It operates without sensation, without sound, without memory. This distance carries a subtle cost. The connection between people and their environment grows thinner. Awareness fades not only of risk, but of process. Protection is taken for granted, yet the comfort it provides is undeniable. Rest is deeper than ever before. Fear rarely appears. Night passes cleanly, without leaving a mark. As the story continues toward its final rest, there is nothing left to build, only something to acknowledge quietly. A world where people sleep safely through the dark, not because they are alert, but because the work of protection has moved so far away that it no longer touches their awareness at all. As the story settles into its final quiet, there is very little left to add, and that is fitting. Night, in this last stage, is no longer something people meet. It is something they pass through without noticing. The home now exists as a stable container for sleep. It does not change its behavior after dark. It does not require confirmation. It does not invite attention. It simply remains. This remaining is the final form of protection. Not action, not response, but continuity. People fall asleep assuming the world will stay the same while they rest. And almost always it does. Doors remain closed. Windows remain still. The shape of the home does not shift. Morning arrives without explanation. In earlier times, this outcome required constant human effort. Listening, checking, responding, cooperating with neighbors, sharing responsibility. That effort shaped how people understood night. Now, the effort has moved elsewhere, into infrastructure, into design, into systems maintained beyond sight and beyond thought. Protection still exists, but it no longer feels personal. This distance creates a particular kind of calm. The mind no longer carries night as a responsibility. Sleep does not feel fragile. It feels assumed. The body releases fully, trusting the environment without question. Because of this trust, night loses its edges. There is no sharp moment of vulnerability, no period that feels exposed. Darkness does not signal change. It simply reduces light. Children growing up in this world inherit that understanding. They do not learn to listen for the night. They learn to ignore it. Sleep arrives easily. Waking is rare. Night leaves no emotional trace. Adults share this experience. They no longer associate darkness with uncertainty. They do not prepare themselves internally for interruption. The environment offers no reason to remain alert. Thoughts soften. Rest deepens. Animals reflect this final stillness. They sleep through the dark hours without response. Their calm presence reinforces the sense that nothing requires attention. When movement does occur, it feels extraordinary because it is so uncommon. Care within the home remains gentle and quiet. Any need that arises is met slowly. Lighting is soft. Voices are low. Nothing challenges the stillness of night. Protection now means preserving silence above all else. Morning confirms this arrangement again and again. Homes appear unchanged. Nothing has moved. Nothing needs explanation. The night has passed without leaving evidence of itself. Over time, people forget that night was ever different. They forget that it once required shared awareness. That safety once depended on listening and cooperation. That sleep was lighter and easily broken. This forgetting is not deliberate. It is the natural result of comfort. When something works consistently, it disappears from thought. Protection becomes invisible precisely because it is reliable. There is a quiet trade hidden in this outcome. What is gained is rest. Deep, uninterrupted rest. What fades is connection. Connection to the environment, to neighbors, to the subtle language of sound and movement that once shaped the night. Yet this is not a story of loss. It is a story of change, of how people slowly shaped their world so that darkness no longer asked anything of them. The night now does what it has always done. It passes, silently, without interruption. Homes remain steady. Sleep remains deep. Morning returns without incident. And in that quiet repetition, the long history of nighttime protection comes to rest.